Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Urban Design Group Idea Space. This is our third session. There we go. This is the third session, and I'm here to introduce Housing, Public Realm, and Parks. It's a 1-hour session. We'll have a presentation by an expert panel. We have Michael Cowdy from McGregor Coxall. We've got Vinita Dhume at Levitt Bernstein, and we have Yolande Barnes, formerly at Savills, head of global research and now chair of UCL's Real Estate Institute. Next week we have Movement and Transport, which will be hosted by Christopher Martin from Urban Movement. And currently we have Urban Nouse recording the session, and it'll be available on the Urban Design Group YouTube station in approximately a week. Essentially, the format of the day is I'll have a really short introduction with a few slides. We'll go to Mike, Vinita, and then Yolande, and then we'll ask everyone to have their microphones on mute, and then we'll go to the session of questions, which should be short and punchy. And basically, if you can just hit participants and raise your hand, or even type it into the chat, we can get to your questions later on. So I'm just sharing my screen. So, as mentioned, this is Housing, Public Realm, and Parks, and we're looking in the context of what's happening with the pandemic. What can we do right away? What could we do in the future? How do we respond? But how do we really question what's happening and make the most of the situation, of the crisis that we have? And many of you probably know a lot of this articles that have been going on, but I thought it was quite interesting to think, since we've had stay-at-home orders, what could change or what should change? A lot of us have appreciated being home and enjoying the freedom that's happened from that situation. And I thought it was quite interesting. One of the world's first offices was in London with the East India Company's office that opened in 1822. And this is a quote from Charles Lamb: "You don't know how wearisome it is to breathe the air of 4 pent-up walls without relief, day after day, all the golden hours of the day between 10 and 4. And I think lots of people have started appreciating being away from the office. And so once we start looking at housing, public realm, and parks, a lot of that has to do with our neighborhoods. And it's interesting to see what other places have put into policy, such as Paris's 15-minute city, which is being fast-tracked as we speak. Or Milan's, there's the proposal for a Corsa Buenos Aires to pedestrianize or give additional space for cyclists and pedestrians. And of course, in Lithuania, there was the idea that cafes, once they start opening up and with physical distancing measures, that actually where the customer is going to sit. And the mayor said, actually, the whole city is a cafe. And just recently, as of yesterday, the GLA's proposal for the streetscape plan across London, and different ideas that are coming forward to how we actually give dwell spaces in a physically distanced world, and this being an emerging sketch from McGregor Coxall on Westminster Bridge. And I wonder if we could even be more proactive and suggest even greater change. About 10 years ago, I worked on a scheme for the city center of York, and what we proposed was once a year we extend the innovative foot streets that were first introduced in York. And we said, well, maybe once a year there's a new pedestrian street. But maybe today's the time where we actually say the whole city center could be pedestrian. Going back to what the original start of the city was, it's 2,000 years old. It was designed before cars, and maybe it's only essential cars and traffic that are able to enter the city. And obviously there was lots of issues with parks, with lots of parks across the country, across the UK, closing down because the actual or perceived overcrowding issues. And there's been, from my perspective, some quite scary proposals for what an open space could be. This one was on the left hand of the screen, was Dzine, suggesting that we have socially distanced parks. And it just seemed a bit sad. And then there was proposals from Italy for beach enclosures, and they look like little greenhouses that you cook in. And so I think, if we start discussing what we want and how we address health and safety afterwards, we can come up with much better solutions. Again, with us being at home so much, there have been proposals for how we actually make better homes, better flats. This one on the screen shows how there could be more flexibility and probably more importantly, how you can have more outdoor space. I know there was an article I read about the have and have-nots, and I was actually the have-not, where you don't have a balcony and everyone else had a balcony and you could see them enjoying life. So I think this session is both to propose or prompt questions and be a bit propositional, and also question what's possible. And then this, I thought, was just a really nice image. When I was working on the bid for Meridian 1, this was one of the placemaking documents. And it kind of evokes the sense of home, but also the idea of landscape on the doorstep. And you know, how we can really envision our neighborhoods, and how public realm, the private realm of our homes, and also parks can also start bleeding into one another. So it was just an initial series of images, just of some different articles and ideas that have been going around. And now I'll hand it over to Mike to discuss more in depth about parks and public spaces.
Cool, that's working. So yeah, I'm going to talk about public realm and open space. It's going to keep it obviously pretty brief, 5 minutes. But when you start looking at public realm and open space, I think it's really important that we look to the past. And actually, when you look at the emergence of city green space, it's always come about in response to mitigating disease and improving public health. And so they have been always perceived and conceived as the green lungs of a city. And in response to that, in the 1800s, the early 1900s, it was seen really important that they started to put a standard to that, because open space was seen really important. So if we go back, they were looking at 2.83 hectares per 1,000 people as a key quantum of open space to support the active lifestyle of people. This was actually looked at designing around people doing gymnastics. It was looked at designing around World War I recuperation. It was also looking at providing people space post-Spanish influenza. So if we then fast forward 100 years, we still maintain that same per capita standard. We look at different standards for cities, but we're still very much quantifying our open space on a very rudimentary basis. We're looking at areas per 1,000 people. So is this the right time now, 100 years later, to start to actually change our planning approach to how we look at open space? And I would argue and say, yes, this is the time. We look at budget cuts. Our parks at the moment aren't responsive to the budgets that are provided. We're allocating an amount of space, but we're not providing a sense of quality. Quality is a hugely important part when we look at public space. We're also conceiving them as islands in a city. We're not seeing them as interconnected urban greenways that link a whole city together. We're seeing them as little pocket spaces that support respite and well-being, where nature and urbanity are seen as separate. But the COVID pandemic and the climate change problem that we're obviously facing is really exposing the frailties in our social and environmental infrastructure. It's highlighting that actually we've not been investing in these key assets as a way of improving social health and well-being and environmental resilience. And in that, we've actually created an economic impact. So it's always traditionally been seen as the last piece of value because it doesn't economically bring value. But actually, in the 21st century now, we need to have an economic model that's applied to this, and therefore change people's perspective on what is economically beneficial for society. And that's why we need to have a paradigm shift. We need to look at more adaptable solutions to a planning model rather than having a static planning model that sits today. We need to look at more a needs-based response, which looks at a multitude of open space typologies that are integrated and connected. And we also need to tie a more blue-green infrastructure approach. That's looking at the holistic nature of our cities in their entirety and looking at all the components, not just parks. Parks form one piece of a valuable piece of blue-green infrastructure in a city, and we need to consider everything. And here are a few ideas when we're looking at that is utilizing the underutilized. We have streets that are not utilized properly. We have roofscapes that aren't utilized properly. We have grey infrastructure components that aren't used properly in cities. And we have our waterscapes. These are just four examples of how we're not utilizing our space. Cities typically around 30% made up of roads. Those roads are for cars. And we can start to see now with the COVID crisis that people are starting to evaluate these roads as actually opportunities for social spaces. This isn't revolutionary. This isn't changing what people have been thinking the last 20 years, but it's actually now on a global scale where people are actually thinking, let's reclaim the street for people. And that's an important component for the future in how we conceive the open space planning model. Streets are part of open spaces. We're also looking at public spaces in the sky. Again, the roof garden is not an unknown thing, but when you look at 2% of our urban rooftops are being utilized for green spaces, open spaces, grass roofs, we realize we're not utilizing this opportunity properly. We also look at a multifunctional waterscape. most cities have a waterscape because that's how we've inherently grown. And there are opportunities now to start looking at interchangeable systems of floating elements. Water spaces can become public spaces. They can become wetland habitats, rest areas, play zones, aquatic baths, and many other programs. The waterscape is an opportunity to connect people to nature and something that will improve their mental health and well-being. And we can start to green the grey. You know, we've been known obviously for the last 70 years in designing huge grey infrastructure elements within our city fabric. Well, let's start to reimagine those as actually green veins that actually permeate through the cities. Let's look at these kind of hard industrial edges and make them into kind of cultural focal points and change the functionality of what are seen as dead, disused spaces. And then actually let's look at a network that uses smart technologies. We have the opportunity now to rethink our planning model because we have technology that understands how things are being used. We can use them to create more engaging outcomes. We can use them to inform public outcomes, and we can use them to create performance data that actually allows us to monitor the performance of these spaces. So this COVID-19 crisis can initiate a paradigm shift in how we plan and perceive our public realm. It can be the moment, I think, where we really rethink the traditional planning model and consider a more integrated, systematic and holistic blue-green approach for our city spaces. And that's it. That's my 5-minute pitch.
Thank you, Mike. Very nice. And we're going to move on to Vinita, who just got in her seat. That's great.
So picking up on what Mike has said, I'm just going to give a 5-minute spell on and focus on mental health and well-being, because we're talking about housing and we're talking about public realm. Sorry, I'm a bit breathless. I had to get to the door. So what does mental health and well-being mean at a time like this? What's really funny, and I'm sure all of us are noticing this, a lot of us sit on our phones. When I travel in the tube, I'm seeing a lot of people on their phones. I'm seeing families spending time together with their phones. And at this COVID-19 situation, I now see a lot of people wanting to be on the streets, trying to get fit, going into the parks. So it's quite an important point. And you've made a very good setting here, Mike, talking about the public realm and how housing actually sits within this public realm. So the point I wanted to make is, as an urban designer, we need to start thinking about the journey all the way from the outside, which is all the way from the park, the street, to your doorstep, as the point that Scott was talking about, and then going into the interior. At this particular time, we are also researching what people are going through in their individual homes, particularly in a place like London. Lots of people are living within studios. They are sometimes crammed in homes with their flatmates. And what is that aspect that is missing in housing in current policy? For example, the GLA is now pushing for higher density housing in many areas, 9 Elms, Canary Wharf. These are perfect examples to show you how high density housing is actually not working in a context like London. So for example, when you look at a small studio, at a time like this, when I see some of my colleagues working from home, is there any aspects such as private amenity space? How is that designed into studios, going all the way from a studio space to a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom? We need to start looking at these simple aspects. When I talk about mental health, for example, I was also thinking about challenging the whole notion of ecology and green walls. Why do we talk about ecological systems just being on the outside and how housing is kind of embedded on it? I think these ecological systems could be micro as well as macro. So for example, it starts from within the interior of your house. So a lot of people have started doing things like greening their homes during this time. It's all about the mental health and well-being. I particularly live in a block which is quite strange. It's a mansion block in Marylebone. It's higher density. And what's really missing in these blocks is that aspect of shared communal amenity space, which is about social cohesion. It's about bringing the community together. And at a time like this, when all of us are pretty much locked into our homes, that aspect becomes extremely important. How do you start to share little hobbies and little things on a day-to-day basis that bring people and communities together within microsystems like little individual housing estates, for example? When I walk along the streets of Canary Wharf, some of the scenes that Scott was actually showing us, what streets need to be. they've got the space, but there's no life on the streets and there's no encouragement on the streets. I walk along streets where there are narrow sidewalks and very wide roads. So the question is, how do we start using some of our street spaces? Do we need wider footpaths going forward on particular streets that don't or will not be carrying that much traffic? I think we need to think about all these things. And what I'm trying to say is the ecology doesn't only have an impact in terms of physical sustainability, but it also has a major impact in terms of your mental and health and well-being within a unit. So the argument is going all the way from macro down to the micro. Because often as urban designers, we tend to think about big spaces, parks, how do buildings sit in a setting. But it's that thinking that should be involved even at the minutest level of how do you start to design an individual home. Whether it's a studio, I say whether it's a 1-bedroom, whether it's a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom. What are the aspects that need to be integrated into that home? So that's all I'm going to leave you with, and to try and think about how we can start greening things, how we can bring communities together. And particularly at a time like this, when there is so much isolation and there might be peaks in society, when we might need to go through these situations, how do we still, as a community, start to function within these open spaces that means so much for us when we're locked indoors?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we're going to move to Yolande.
Well, good evening, everyone. And yes, what I want to suggest is that this COVID crisis has had the effect of actually accelerating or acting as a catalyst to trends that were already in play. And I would argue it's kind of fast forwarded us 10 years into the urban future, as it were, because it's highlighted and really brought home a lot of the issues that we were already grappling with. And these issues don't lie just in the area of health and well-being or just in the area of green infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure. They lie across a whole range of areas, from finance through to society, from demographics to technology. While we're testing the limits of technology at the moment, I know I certainly am, and what this, for one thing, has shown is that the lines between different types of use, all those sort of planning use classes and investment asset classes that we've thought of in the past, the office, retail, home, are all merging. Where does your home now stop and the office start? I think the genie is out of the bottle, and we've got to start thinking about workspace, for example, at different levels. The home, the central office, perhaps satellite offices, and even, and this is I think most important, the neighbourhood in which we are working. So I personally cannot wait to start interacting with real human beings face to face, and I think all of us need an element of that. So even if we're working at home in future, I suspect most of us will be popping into the town centre to meet up with friends or even colleagues in the same area, and doing things at a far greater variety of levels of geographies. And so this, if we're talking about housing, public realm and parks, that starts to speak to the old way of doing things, breaking a piece of land down into a park, another piece of land, public realm, another piece of land, office, another piece of land, housing. And what we're actually seeing is that housing is about much more than the four walls in which we're all stuck currently. It's actually what happens when you step outside your front door. That picture of the landscape that Scott showed, is so important. And I think some people find themselves in actually very expensive apartments or flats, thinking somewhat less of their home because this crisis has showed up the neighbourhood that they're in. And so all these things that we have to start thinking about, considering the streetscape as public realm, as valuable as the dedicated parks. In fact, in many ways more valuable, because the street is the vector by which you get from where you are to where you want to be. So even if you want to go to the park, your experience of getting there is going to be part of that urban experience. So we clearly have to consider all of these different types and uses as a whole. So the ecology of the city goes way beyond the blue-green infrastructure. It goes to the way we use it, and frankly, how reliant we need to be on the internal combustion engine, which then sort of feeds, again, COVID has forced us to think, as a few of us were thinking every time it snowed, looking at the tracks of cars and how little space they actually take of our urban realm, and reallocating the space back to people on bikes, or very occasionally in cars or delivery trucks, but more especially on foot. So that reallocation, that reprioritization of space away from the internal combustion engine is going to be an incredibly important part of what happens next, of the post-COVID world, as it were. I think the problems of physical distancing, unless we're very lucky and get a vaccine extremely quickly, and do bear in mind that they've been looking for one for HIV for 40 years now, we may be faced with this sort of event at a much more frequent interval. It may be that it just survives, the only way it survives going forward is sort of in our minds, with those sort of mental 2-meter barriers that we start to put up around us. Or it may be that we have to experience that and this sort of thing on a more frequent basis. Now, if we do experience this sort of thing on a more frequent basis, our mindsets in terms of how we judge our environments, how we judge the desirability of a particular house or property or workspace or even employer, will be very much clouded by this. There will be all sorts of issues, things we haven't considered before, as being will start to be a real issue. I personally have great reservations about for the future of tall towers, certainly tall towers for office use, simply because with ongoing physical or intermittent physical distancing, you're just not going to be able to get a significant number of workers up to anything above the 6th floor because of lift capacity and the problem of elevators. So we actually have to rethink city forms from that point of view, and be much more agile about being able to change uses. So, for example, put lower residential on the top of towers, so that because people will need to use the lift less often, for example. We need to reprioritize road spaces. We need to think about streets, roofscapes, and so forth as part of the green infrastructure. And we also have to consider how the use of new technologies may change everything. Maybe we'll all get used to riding the tube with independent air supplies, sort of hoods or whatever. Who knows? What this does do, though, is force us to reconsider how we use cities. And I think it's very interesting that Scott put up a map of York earlier, because there's a city that people planned, as it were, for themselves, by themselves a long time ago, but which still, for walking and cycling sort of economy, actually still very much makes sense. So I think if we have to summarize the effect of all of this, it's that we're moving away from roads for motor vehicles and towards streets for people. And that encapsulates how we're going to reuse and think about the use of land very much more for people, as the first cities were, rather than for industry or business or commerce as later cities have been. So that's my opening salvo.
Excellent. Thank you.